EMDR is something that's been spoken about a lot more and requested by clients. But what is it? And is it the type of therapy that you need? Well, I decided to speak to an EMDR specialist so that you could get all the information that you need. And so today we're speaking with Janet, a licensed clinical social worker based in the States. She's also trained in attachment-focused EMDR, the havening technique, and other trauma modalities. As you'll see, Janet is incredibly knowledgeable in this area, and she has a knack of explaining difficult concepts in a really simple way. When I asked for a bio from Janet, she sent over some information, and I just loved this bit. She said, "I want everyone who enters my office to know that your emotions aren't too much for me. Your anger isn't too scary to me. Your pain is something that I am willing to honour and sit with. And your traumatic experiences won't disturb me. I will help you hold all of this so we can work together to help you get some relief and create the life you want." When I read this before doing the interview, it made me so excited about speaking with her. And I have to say, the interview did not disappoint. And so I won't hold it from you for much longer, but I just want to give you a quick introduction from me before we get stuck in. So my name's Lara, I am a therapist and career coach, and I also do some mindfulness teaching. I post weekly videos on here, so hit the subscribe button if you're interested in hearing more. But for now, let's get started. Welcome. So thank you so much for joining me today and offering to have this conversation with us. I would love to hear in your own words, what it is that you do and sort of the client group that you typically tend to work with.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So my name is Janet. I'm a psychotherapist. I specialize in working with survivors of trauma, survivors of post-traumatic stress, and I'm in the United States. I'm physically located in Los Angeles, California, but I'm licensed in several states, so I can work with anybody in the state of California, Florida, Texas, and South Carolina.
Amazing. Okay. And in terms of the sort of the work that you do with the clients within, you specialise with sort of the PTSD and the traumatic survivors. I guess what is it that you specifically do when you're working with these clients?
Yeah, so a lot of it, honestly, at the beginning is when clients come in and they're seeking therapy, a lot of initially is like building trust with that individual, because oftentimes survivors of trauma, they don't feel safe, whether it's consciously or subconsciously. They don't necessarily trust others, again, whether they're aware of that or not. So a lot of it is just building that sense of safety with the individual, building rapport, and then supporting the client in understanding that they may have experienced a trauma, because so often, we're not aware that certain experiences or certain situations were potentially traumatic. I think, some situations are kind of obvious, right? Like if somebody went to combat war, yes, we understand that there's PTSD involved in that. But oftentimes, other experiences like some relational challenges, or if, you experience neglect or abandonment, sometimes clients are not aware that that was actually a traumatic experience for them. So a lot of it is just education. And then, there's so many layers to this work. And then, essentially we identify, so how was that traumatic experience impacting you then, but also impacting you now? And then from there, we work towards your goals and creating safety, working on regulating your nervous system, things like that.
Amazing. And so, a lot of that work that has to be done beforehand is building that relationship and kind of building that sense of trust between yourself and the client, and then sort of moving towards actually, okay, maybe labeling whatever has happened as, a traumatic event, so someone can have that understanding around it.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, amazing. And I guess in terms of for you, what kind of led you into this sort of specific type of work, or what kind of led you into sort of wanting to practice as a therapist?
Yeah, there's so many layers to that question as well. I feel like every therapist has their journey regarding how they got into this field. For me personally, I feel like in a way, like this field kind of chose me. I've always been an avid active listener. I was an only child, so I kind of was around adults a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So, I was very good at listening, and I was always a very compassionate and empathetic person. So I feel like I already had some of these traits that would make me a really impactful therapist. But on the other hand, and I'm not shy talking about this, I am a survivor of traumatic experiences myself. So that really led me to essentially picking this specialty because I'm so passionate about it. I also, I've done my own work
Mm-hmm.
in my own intensive trauma therapy. So I feel like I also understand what happens from just a client's
Yeah.
perspective as well. And I feel like trauma survivors are honestly some of the most resilient people that I've ever met. So
Mm-hmm.
it's truly an honor to be able to work with survivors of such challenging experiences.
Yeah, of course, of course. And I can imagine, having someone come into the room and, bringing this stuff, but knowing that actually the transformation maybe they're going to be able to take on that journey, having maybe been on that journey yourself, that must feel really special.
Absolutely. I feel like I wouldn't be able to ask, people to do this work had I not been able to do
Yeah,
so myself as well.
yeah, yeah. Okay, amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And I know that you do some EMDR and some brain spotting. I guess what is it that if someone is interested in either of those types of works, what is it that someone should know? People might even not even know what either of those things are. What would you say
Yeah.
about them? How would you introduce those to us?
Yeah. So, yes, I am a certified EMDR therapist. I'm also trained in brain spotting and another type of therapy called the havening techniques.
Mm-hmm.
So these specific therapies are actually evidence-based, and they specifically target traumatic experiences. So the reason why I sought training in these therapies is because early in my career, when I was still working towards my license and in private practice, I would actually have a large clientele that experienced trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And not to say that talk therapy can't help, but what I found was that with just talking about trauma, we hit a wall. Clients increased their insight regarding what happened. They were better able to understand themselves, which is great. But in terms of their symptoms, like
Mm-hmm.
the depression, the anxiety, feeling hypervigilant, those symptoms we started to notice it didn't change,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately. And, as therapists, we all want our clients to have an ease in their symptoms, and we want them to feel better. So I sought training in EMDR initially, and EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It was developed by a psychologist. Her name is Dr. Francine Shapiro. She recently passed away. But what she found is when we do eye movements back and forth, when we're thinking about a distressing life event, we actually move into some of the deeper parts of our brain where a lot of trauma is stored. Trauma often is stored in our body. So the way that I kind of explain it is, for example, if somebody went to combat war, right? Logically, they can understand that their hypervigilance, the nightmares, it's not their fault, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they were just in a very challenging situation. But for whatever reason, what may happen is we may hold shame in the body. And
Mm-hmm.
for whatever reason, logically, we're not able to pull ourselves out of shame.
Mm-hmm.
So, why EMDR, brain spotting, and some of these therapies can be so powerful is because we're moving to some of the deeper parts of our brain where trauma is stored to
Yeah.
reprocess them and to hopefully have a healing experience.
Yeah. And I guess if there was someone who felt that they weren't able to verbalize some of the traumatic experiences that they'd had, would that be helpful in those circumstances?
Absolutely. I often tell people that you don't have to cognitively remember, the body will remember.
Yeah.
So, if a client is sitting with me in the office, or even if we're in a virtual space having a virtual appointment, if they're describing something, I may say, like, so where do you notice that in your body?
Mm-hmm.
Where do you feel the anxiety in your body? Where do you feel the tension in your body? Those are some of the cues where we can start actually processing some of the distressing memories, even if we don't have like a conscious memory that comes forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And that feels really important, kind of, I guess, when working within this client group to, I guess, really acknowledge that, we don't necessarily have to go back there, because that can be really re-traumatizing for some people as well, can't it? To actually, have to verbalize what it is that they've been through.
Yeah. And I tell people all the time, like, if you don't want to talk about it, I'm not here to force you, and no one should force you to talk about it. What we can do is start with helping stabilize the body and stabilizing the nervous system, because so often, like, your nervous system is just out of whack.
Yeah. I find EMDR fascinating. I don't know as much about brain spotting, but it's something that I think that, in my future, I definitely want to investigate and do some additional training in. And, with certain clients that I've worked with, that I've signposted them to it, because I think that, like you say, maybe the talking therapy has taken us so far, and, it's created some great sort of adjustments and shifts. But there's kind of something subconsciously still going on that we've quite not been able to unlock.
Right. Yeah, that can make, the EMDR therapy very powerful.
Yeah. Okay. And I guess for someone who is sort of wanting to try EMDR, I guess for you, in the way that you work, would it be that actually they would need to kind of do several sessions working with you on kind of a talk therapy basis first, and then do the EMDR, because of that kind of wanting that relationship and that trust first? Or would you work with someone on kind of an EMDR sort of specialist basis?
Yeah, it depends. A lot of this is case by case. I often recommend, when we're doing trauma therapy, to go slow. Like, this is not something that we necessarily want to rush. And I get it. It sounds very counterintuitive, because I often get calls and, clients will ask me, so how many sessions of this am I going to need? And, can I do it quickly and then I'll be good?
If only, I know that's what we all want, right?
I know that people just want to feel better. I would want that for myself too, early in my journey. But that's not necessarily how this works, because, again, like, that relationship, like, if you were my therapist, Laura, I would want to feel comfortable and safe with you. And, and that takes time. Rapport building takes time. So, in fact, some of the clients that come in that have tried EMDR before and haven't had a good experience, in my opinion, is because they, like, jumped into it right away without establishing that foundation. So I often tell people the relationship is key. Like, who you're working with is incredibly important. You'll want to feel comfortable and safe with them. And then I often tell people, with EMDR, I also don't want to throw you right into the trauma memory initially either. Like, I want us to do the bilateral eye movements or the bilateral tapping with just regulating your body and regulating your nervous system first, so that we have also that foundation before we work on a lot of the distressing memories. So that's typically how I work, and that's what I would recommend. On the flip side, though, if let's say you're coming in and you only have, like, one traumatic experience that you've had in your life, like a car accident, for example, I like to use that example, and you just want to feel safe and comfortable getting back in the car, driving on the highway, and you had, like, a relatively great childhood, you had supportive parents, you had a stable foundation already, then in those cases, generally speaking, we could probably start EMDR a little bit sooner, and you may not need a lot of EMDR sessions. Actually, that may clear up in 1 or 2 EMDR appointments. But I tell people, like, if you were someone that had very complex traumatic events and, a challenging childhood, then yes, the work will likely be a little bit slower.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. And it sounds like, that sort of initial conversation that you have with the practitioner is really important, in terms of understanding actually what is it that kind of, I guess, is it that you've been through, so that we can understand how our approach that we're going to take. But, the main thing that I'm getting from this conversation and what you're saying is that, with traumatic events, it's important for us to take it slowly, that this is a really vulnerable space that we're putting ourselves in, and whilst maybe we kind of want that healing as quickly as possible, that there's an analogy actually that I read recently, which was kind of like saying that therapy is almost like reorganizing your wardrobe, and you take everything out, and you're sort of putting it on the bed and thinking, I'll just fold it up and put it back in. But actually the longer we take sort of folding the items back up and putting them back in, the better organized they are. And it's kind of reminding me of that a little bit.
I love that analogy. And I also, to use that analogy, I think, when we're reorganizing our wardrobe, we can also look at our clothing and see like, oh, this doesn't fit me anymore. I don't need this. I can, get rid of this.
So if we take the time, we can actually say, is this serving me anymore? Or as Mary Kondo would say, does it bring me joy? And
yes, totally.
Okay. So for someone who is interested in EMDR, I guess, and they want to have a session, or maybe they've been working with you for a while and they're ready to now sort of start, doing those sessions. Is there anything that someone should do to prepare for that, or is there anything they need to think about?
Well, I think the biggest thing is to, first of all, feel comfortable with your therapist, as I've said, and then it'll be kind of important to identify, are there specific memories that you want to work on in your life, or is there a specific time period, in your childhood or in your adult life that you feel triggered by. I think a good starting point is to just be aware of, this is a memory that when I still think about it, I have a charge. I feel a charge in my nervous system and in my body. That is a good way to help, facilitate in your therapy the direction that you want to go in. I also recommend, having a really important support system. And I know not everyone has that, but that's also something that I would encourage to, bring into your session so that you have a space to create that and talk about that in your work together. And then, I also tell people that like EMDR also doesn't have to be for everyone. Like if you've had that experience, but maybe it didn't work for you, you can try something else. EMDR is not the only trauma modality. We have brain spotting, we have havening, we have sensory motor, psychotherapy, trauma resiliency model. Like there's so many different therapies out there. So, EMDR is not the end all. So that's another thing to keep in mind as well.
It's brilliant when you work with a trauma specialist, that they're able to have these kind of different tools in their toolkit that they can say, if this one thing isn't working for you, let's maybe try something else.
Yes, absolutely.
But it is, I guess, if you're wanting to work on that trauma, specifically finding someone who is trauma informed is so important, isn't it?
Yes, for sure. You want somebody that's trauma informed, somebody that has trauma therapy experience and perhaps has some of these certifications as well.
Yeah. Okay. And I guess sort of leaning on what we were talking about a little bit earlier in terms of, using these different techniques, like the havening technique, brain spotting, EMDR, versus talk therapy. I guess from your experience, what is it that changes, allows that extra shift? What is it that someone can benefit from sort of using one of those different approaches to just talk therapy?
Well, like I said, with talk therapy, we can gain a lot of insight, which is amazing. Like, I think knowledge is part of our power. Knowledge is important for our awareness and how we show up and how we move forward. So the talk therapy is great. But I oftentimes, if a client doesn't directly come to me and say, I want to do EMDR or I want to do brain spotting, I may suggest it because, like I said, we may hit a wall with symptoms, like your symptoms are not improving or you're not feeling better. Or I may suggest it because the insight has increased, like there's a lot of healthy awareness, but let's say you're still tearful every day, or you're not sure how to change a feeling, for example. That's when I typically suggest it. And then for sure, like if I notice clients are wanting to do deeper work, that they're ready for that, whether they tell me they're ready, or I may see like you're stable, you've done a lot of that insight oriented work already, I may, suggest it down the line as part of our treatment. And then other times, clients, they'll do their own research and they'll say, hey, I've heard about EMDR, or my friend told me about this and it really helped them. Can you tell me more? And how can we incorporate that into our treatment? So it can come up in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that people are hearing, specifically the EMDR. People are hearing a lot more about these days. I think it's been starting to be spoken about a lot more. I'm not sure what's kind of created that shift, but it does seem like it's sort of something that people are sort of requesting more. Have you found that at all?
Oh, for sure. In the last few years, and I think a lot of it is due to pop culture. I think more pop culture. We are talking about mental health, which I'm glad that we are actually. And I've actually seen EMDR on some of these, even like these reality shows.
Right.
One that's coming up for me, the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. One of the cast members, they went through a robbery,
Right.
and in order for her to process that traumatic event, she saw an EMDR therapist.
Right.
So we've been seeing it a lot more talked about in our pop culture. We've been seeing it a lot more on TV, which I think is great to bring awareness and share with people that this can actually really help you if you need it.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? It's, the conversation around mental health is definitely evolving, and I guess with that, we're sort of starting to broaden our understanding as a society around the different types of routes of support that are available.
Yes, for sure. Sure.
I guess one of the things that I've seen a lot on social media and in pop culture is people talking around sort of the big T versus little T trauma. What would be your explanation of that kind of term?
Yeah, so big T trauma, I characterize it as kind of like the very obvious experiences that have caused this trauma. So I brought up combat war, sexual assault, physical abuse, domestic violence, things along those lines. I think we can all identify as big T traumas where, it's very clear that that was an incredibly distressing event, and we notice ourselves having post-traumatic stress or acute stress following those experiences. When it comes to the little T traumas, I think those are the traumas that are probably a little bit more covert. Like, we're not fully aware that something like that was traumatic. And I brought up the example of, maybe in our childhood, we experienced neglect, emotional neglect from our families, or abandonment feelings following a breakup. There's a lot of talk right now on narcissistic abuse and being a narcissist. That can either be a big T or little T, depending on how each individual sees it. So I think the little T is some of the more covert that maybe we're not fully aware of, but like, we notice that after those experiences, we do change. We do, maybe shrink ourselves, or we do have some of these fears and concerns and symptoms that are perhaps not as obvious as like the big T trauma.
Yeah, okay, that totally makes sense. And I guess when you're working with people who have experienced trauma, do you find that kind of working face to face is beneficial? Do you find that it's kind of absolutely fine to be working online? What's your kind of thoughts on that?
I think either option is powerful, honestly. Prior to COVID, I, like probably a lot of people, a lot of clinicians, thought, oh, virtual is not as great, virtual is not as powerful. But when we all were forced to be virtual, I actually found it to be just as powerful. And some people actually preferred it more to in person, because, they're more comfortable in their space. Or when we're doing that intensive trauma work or the EMDR, they have their animals, so they have their nurturing figures with them. So either way is honestly powerful. I think it just depends on each individual's preference. And also, if you are, doing the sessions from your home or your own personal space, just to, make sure that you have privacy, that you feel comfortable. Those may be some of the limitations if you want to do virtual from home.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. It seems like there's kind of pros and cons of both, and I guess it's been widely discussed now, hasn't it? I remember speaking to one of my friends who was doing EFT, and he was kind of saying that actually it's really nice to not have to get on the tube and kind of go home when you're in such an emotional state. And so to be in your own home, to feel safe, that is incredibly important. And it's a way of working that maybe we just weren't doing before, but it's a great benefit.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the EMDR, the brain spotting, the havening technique, do you find, does that work virtually? It kind of translates well as well?
Oh yeah, for sure. We can certainly provide these therapies virtually. Again, important factors include, do you feel safe in your surroundings? Do you not have any distractions around you? Like those are some of the things that we need to have in place. If you're doing that intensive work, you'll want to have water and tissues next to you. Normally the therapist would provide that in the office space, but we want to have that in your own space virtually. So those are some of the things to think about. But I will say that, like, even in the last couple of years, I recently got trained in brain spotting earlier this year, and I got trained online. So it can be done virtually.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? It's amazing that that's possible, and I think that that means that we can work with people who maybe otherwise wouldn't be able to access these types of therapies, and so that is fantastic.
For sure, particularly in the rural communities where there aren't as many, therapists that are close by. I love that we can now have this option.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, and so for someone who maybe has experienced trauma, they're wanting to go into therapy, they're wanting to explore this more, seek support. I guess, is there anything that you would suggest following the session? Anything that they should be thinking about, when the session has finished, that they should be considering or thinking about doing?
Yes, that's a really great question. So what I often tell people following an EMDR session, brain spotting, havening, the ones that I do, and I'm sure this is true for some of the other trauma therapies, is oftentimes, even let's say like the session, you've wrapped it up and session's over, you'll see your therapist next week. Your brain could still be processing even after the session is over. And you may see that, you may feel a little bit more tired after the session or drained. I've heard a lot of people say, like, I feel drained after EMDR. Some people notice an increase in their dreams when they're going to sleep that night. So what I would encourage, if possible, I know this isn't always possible for everyone, but to, have maybe like a lighter schedule or a little bit of downtime after these sessions so that you can regroup and recoup from your day. I also encourage, to journal, to do some journal writing, again, because your brain might have more messages to send to you or more dreams that come up. So journaling, that can be very powerful. So I just recommend, a lot of self-care after these sessions are done, and a little bit of downtime so that, like, let's say today you and I are meeting on a Tuesday. You're not jumping right back into work right away after these sessions, because that can be a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I can see that. And it's fascinating. Like you say, maybe it's because that trauma is stored in our body, but that it's maybe then coming through to us, in us wanting to journal or in our dreams as well.
Yes, because if you think about it, like, your brain is doing a lot of releasing. It's every person's response to the EMDR or the brain spotting is very different, but I generally see it as like you're releasing a lot of negative core beliefs. You're releasing a lot of emotions that were stored in the body. You're releasing some memories that you had been carrying for quite some time. It's a huge release. So of course you're going to feel tired. Of course you're going to feel drained. So that's why, yes, I encourage, to take it a little bit easier if possible, because it's a lot. You're doing a lot in that 1 hour.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of about securing some space after the session, making sure that you're kind of planning to sort of look after yourself, not planning too much that's going on, but also maybe kind of offering yourself some time to really reflect on what's been going. So it's maybe not just staying up here, it's kind of, able to put it down on paper somewhere.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
It's reminding me that I've had clients in the past describe that feeling after the session of being drained as an emotional hangover, which I felt was such an apt kind of description of that feeling of kind of just feeling exhausted and kind of just drained.
Yeah, that's a legitimate feeling for sure. And again, if we compare it to your earlier example of kind of cleaning out your closet and organizing, even that can be a draining process, because certain clothing, you may carry certain memories or certain experiences when you come up upon it, or like kind of getting rid of stuff can feel emotional. So that example can be used in this example with doing this therapy.
Yeah, amazing. Okay. I think that's incredibly helpful, really, useful for people who are, going to be exploring therapy. Well, you've mentioned as well the Havening technique, which is something that I find fascinating as well, and I think there's maybe less information about that. So would you mind explaining to us exactly what that is?
Yes. So the Havening techniques is a psychosensory modality. So it's not traditional psychotherapy. It's not like talking back and forth. The idea behind the Havening techniques is we're using a specific type of touch to help regulate the nervous system and to help also process traumatic events that are stored in the body through this particular self-soothing type of touch. It was actually born in the UK.
Oh, amazing.
My doctor, I believe his name is Dr. Ronald Rudin.
Okay.
And then it was brought to the United States. And we have a strong Havening community here in Los Angeles. I know there's a strong Havening community in New York as well. And again, the idea behind it is you're doing, and I can show you, it's like a specific type of touch that produces delta waves in the body. And these are the waves that are created in our most relaxed state. So typically that happens in our sleep when we're relaxed and typically dreaming. And so through this touch, we're actually mimicking that feeling, the delta waves, to soothe the body, to regulate the nervous system. So it's incredibly powerful in learning how to, particularly like if you're a highly anxious person, or if you're struggling with any sort of anxiety attacks, panic attacks, doing this type of touch can be very grounding. And, I tell people all the time, like, even if you think about a baby, an infant that's dysregulated, that's crying, that needs something, what typically happens? The caregiver, the mother or the father, they go to the baby and they pick the baby up and they touch and they soothe. And that typically helps calm the baby down. And that's essentially what we're doing here in a nutshell with the Havening techniques.
And what I love about what you're doing is you're kind of, I guess, giving people these tools that they can actually sort of take into everyday life, but also that kind of knowledge as to why these things are working and why that what it is that's maybe going on for us that kind of helps to bring about that sense of calm, to help us feel regulated again. It feels really powerful.
Yeah, definitely. I love this modality because it's something that I can teach every client. Like, if you were my client here, we're in a virtual space, I would just have you do this with me and ask you how it felt. And then you can take that with you, into your life. And if you're noticing you're feeling anxious, or, if you're having a hard time falling asleep, I would say, try this, see how it goes.
And what's really interesting kind of watching you do that is that I think that, I see people, and I quite often will do this. I'll quite often, self-soothe in that sense, help find myself kind of, touching my arms like this. But, recently kind of I've noticed that I have a friend who quite often is doing this, and there's, maybe something subconscious that we do that to self-soothe naturally.
Yeah. I agree. Absolutely.
And so I guess, the client group that you're working with, working specifically with people who have experienced trauma, it's incredibly important work, but also it's difficult work. I guess, how do you look after yourself as a clinician? How do you make sure that you're kind of, taking care of yourself?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So boundaries are incredibly important. So I try to have really healthy boundaries in terms of my schedule. I try to, only see a certain number of clients per day. If I go over that, I know by the end of the day, I may feel burnt out. And I also only take, specific diagnoses and clients that I know I can particularly handle. So I tend to work with a lot of women. I do have some men that I work with, and I love working with men as well. But I also know what my limitations are. And as an example, I can't work with sex offenders. I know that sex offenders also have trauma in their history, but it's something that would be dysregulating for me, actually. And I would have a lot of countertransference. So I also am aware of my own limitations as well. And I make sure to also do things for my body to make sure my nervous system is okay. So I love to engage in movement. So exercising, walking, dance movement is incredibly healing. So I try to do that outside of my work schedule. And that's how I take care of myself. And I also I consult with a lot of colleagues, because I also know that I don't always have the answers. I may have questions. So those are some of the things that I do.
So it sounds like it's really practicing what you preach, isn't it? In terms of having those really, those firm boundaries that you respect and you honour, kind of being really transparent and aware about your own limitations and, what it is that you are, willing and able to work with in a way that kind of feels comfortable to you. But yeah, even those kind of the things that I think that we so often easily forget in terms of keeping moving, keeping networking, that those are really important as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that kind of lends nicely onto my final question for you, which is around, I guess, in terms of through the work that you do, through the work that, with clients, I guess what's the most important lesson that you have learnt, over your time as a clinician?
Yeah. I think in certain experiences, I've had to have humility that, I don't know the answers, for everyone's problems. At the end of the day, each individual is their own expert for what they're feeling in their body, for their own experiences. So I think a big lesson that I've learned is that, I'm not here to fix anyone. I'm here to support people and I'm here to guide through the process, but that healing and recovery, is each individual's responsibility. So, that was a big lesson I learned early on in my clinical practice. Yeah. And again, even with clients I've heard a lot of stories. I've heard a lot of very challenging stories. And, these people are, again, some of the most resilient people I've ever met. So their stories may seem so harsh and so challenging. And yes, often they are, but through that collaborative work and through that, relationship, the therapist client safe relationship, a lot of wonderful forward movement can happen.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. It's been really wonderful to speak with you, and you've offered so much insight. So it's fantastic.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I loved all of your questions, and I hope that this space helps answer a lot of questions for people, and definitely, do the research about some of these therapies. I think they're great.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you so much. And that's it. I feel like there is so much to learn from some of the stuff that Janet has said, and she's got me really excited about doing some further training in EMDR and the havening technique. Has it made you interested in exploring this as a type of therapy for yourself? Let us know in the comments. And if you're interested in working with Janet, I've got all of her information in the description below.